It was a cold January morning in 1902 when Inspector Josef Procházka stood over the frozen ground on the edge of Stromovka. The snow that had fallen the previous night was disturbed by a series of footprints leading to the spot where the body of a young woman lay. Procházka examined the deep prints in the fresh snow and pondered. This could be a clue to the perpetrator, the only one they had so far. Inspector, a young constable named Maresh, ran up to him, his cheeks red from the cold. "The doctor is on his way. We've cordoned off the area as you ordered." Procházka nodded, not taking his eyes off the tracks. They were distinct. Heavy boots with a characteristic pattern on the sole. The perpetrator must have been a stout man, judging by the depth of the prints in the frozen ground. "Maresh, bring me paper and a pencil. I want to sketch these tracks before more snow covers them." While waiting for the constable, Procházka walked around the crime scene, studying other tracks. They led from a nearby path directly to the body, and then back again. The perpetrator must have lingered here for some time. The area around the body was trampled, and the tracks overlapped. "That's odd," he muttered to himself when he noticed that one of the boots had a distinctive defect, a small protrusion on the heel that left a tiny indentation in each print. Maresh returned with the requested supplies, and Procházka began carefully sketching the most prominent tracks. However, he was not satisfied with the result. The drawing couldn't capture all the details he saw in the prints. At that moment, he remembered an article he had read in a German police magazine. It described a new method used in Berlin, casting tracks with plaster. He had never tried it, but perhaps it was time for an experiment. "Maresh, go to the nearest pharmacy and bring plaster, a lot of plaster, and then find a container for water and mixing." The young constable looked puzzled, but obediently ran off to fulfill the order. Meanwhile, Procházka used several boards to create makeshift frames around the best-preserved tracks. When Maresh returned with the plaster and a bucket, a few onlookers had already gathered behind the police tape, curiously watching the inspector's activity. "What's that you're doing, Inspector?" Maresh asked, as Procházka began mixing plaster with water. "We're going to try to preserve these tracks," Procházka replied, carefully pouring the thin plaster into the first frame. "If we succeed, we'll have an exact imprint of the perpetrator's shoe." The work was tedious and required patience. They had to wait for the plaster to harden and then carefully remove the casts. To Procházka's delight, they managed to obtain 3 very high-quality imprints, including the one with the distinctive heel indentation. Dr. Novak, the police physician who had arrived at the scene in the meantime, watched their actions with interest. "This is an interesting method, Procházka. Where did you learn it?" "I read about it," the inspector replied, carefully wrapping the casts in newspaper. "The Germans have been using it for some time. I think it could be useful for us, too." The following days were filled with intense investigation. Witness interviews revealed that the victim, a 22-year-old maid named Marie Novotna, had a meeting with an unknown man. However, no one could describe him. It was already dark when they saw her leave. Procházka and his team went through the surrounding neighborhoods, showing people sketches of the shoes based on the casts, and asking if they had seen anyone with similar footwear. The work was exhausting and seemed to lead nowhere. A breakthrough in the case came a week later. An old cobbler from Holešovice remembered repairing similar shoes a month earlier. He specifically recalled the unusual defect on the heel, which he had to fix by adding a piece of leather. "It was some worker from the brewery," the cobbler recalled. "A big guy. I don't remember his name, but I know he works at that new warehouse." At the brewery, they identified the man as Josef Kratochvíl, an auxiliary worker. When they brought him in for questioning, Procházka immediately noticed his heavy work boots. "Mr. Kratochvíl, "Can you show us your shoes?" he asked. Kratochvíl hesitated only briefly, then took them off. Procházka carefully compared them with the casts. The tread pattern matched exactly, including the distinctive heel protrusion. "Where were you last Thursday evening?" Procházka asked. "At the pub," Kratochvíl replied quickly. "Like every Thursday." "And after that?" "I went straight home." "Through Stromovka?" Kratochvíl turned pale. "No. Well, maybe. I don't remember." Procházka placed the casts of the tracks in front of him. "Do you see these imprints? We found them in Stromovka, leading directly to where Marie Novotna was murdered. And here," he pointed to the distinctive indentation, "is the same defect as on your shoe." Kratochvíl broke down within an hour. He admitted that he knew Marie. She occasionally came to the brewery to get beer for her employers. He had started following her, sending her letters. When she rejected him, he couldn't accept it. That evening, he waited for her in Stromovka. The case attracted considerable attention, not only because of its severity, but also because of the new method that led to its resolution. The police director had Procházka prepare a detailed report on the use of plaster casts. "It's a revolutionary method," Procházka explained to his colleagues, "not just for tracks in soft terrain, but also for tire prints, hoof prints, really anything that leaves a three-dimensional mark." In the following months, Procházka developed a detailed methodology for securing tracks using casts. He experimented with different materials and techniques until he found the best way to preserve even the finest details. His method soon spread to other cities. A year later, when investigating a series of burglaries in Královské Vinohrady, he already had a complete set of tools for casting tracks and several trained officers who knew how to use the method. In this case, they managed to secure shoe prints at several crime scenes. Thanks to the precise casts, they could prove that all the burglaries were committed by the same perpetrator. The shoes had specific wear patterns on the toe and heel. The perpetrator, an experienced safecracker named František Dvořák, was astonished when they showed him the casts of his tracks. "How did you do it?" he asked incredulously. "I always made sure not to leave any tracks." "Everyone leaves tracks," Procházka replied. "We've just learned to read them better." Over the years, the method continued to improve. New materials were developed that better captured details. Police officers learned to secure not only tracks in soil and snow, but also tire prints, vehicle tracks, even animal tracks when relevant to the investigation. In 1905, Procházka established a specialized department for securing tracks at the police headquarters. He trained a team of technicians who responded to serious cases throughout Bohemia. Their work contributed to solving many complex cases. One of the most significant successes came in the winter of 1907, when a dangerous robber was caught thanks to the tracks he left in the snow while fleeing the scene of a robbery. The plaster casts of the tracks not only helped identify the perpetrator, but also mapped his escape route, leading to the discovery of the hidden loot. Procházka became a recognized expert in the field. He lectured at the police academy, wrote articles for professional journals, and consulted on complex cases. His methods became a standard part of criminal investigation work. "Remember," he used to tell his students, "a track is not just an imprint in the ground. It's a story left by the perpetrator. We just have to learn to read it." When he retired in 1910, he could look back on the significant changes that Czech criminalistics had undergone. From an institution relying primarily on testimonies and confessions, it had become a modern service using scientific methods. His last case before retirement seemed to symbolically close the circle. It was again a murder in Stromovka, and again there were tracks in the snow. But this time, he didn't have to experiment. His team secured perfect casts within an hour. "Do you see the difference?" he said to the young inspector who was to take his place. 8 years ago, we were groping and trying new things. Today, we have a refined method, equipment, and experience. The young inspector nodded. And what will be the next step? How will criminalistics evolve further? Procházka pondered. Science doesn't stop. New methods, new technologies will come. But the basic principle remains the same. Observe carefully, document meticulously, think logically. In the last days of his active service, Procházka wrote a comprehensive manual on securing tracks, which became a fundamental textbook for new generations of criminalists. It contained not only technical procedures, but also numerous case studies and practical advice based on his long experience. Every case is unique, he wrote in conclusion, but they all have something in common. The perpetrator always leaves some trace. Our task is to find it and interpret it correctly. His legacy lives on. Modern criminalists may use more sophisticated materials and technologies, but the basic principles that Procházka introduced remain valid. Every new police officer learns how to properly secure and document tracks at a crime scene. And somewhere in the archives of the Police Museum, those first plaster casts from the case of Marie Novotná are still preserved. A silent testimony to the beginning of a new era in Czech criminalistics. In 1920, when Procházka was long retired, a young criminalist visited him for advice on a complex case. He brought with him photographs of 6 different shoe prints secured at various crime scenes. "Do you see the subtle differences?" Procházka pointed to the seemingly identical prints. "Each shoe wears out in a unique way. These all come from the same pair of shoes, but they were made at different times. You can read an entire story from them." And he was right. When they arranged the prints chronologically, they revealed the pattern of the perpetrator's movements, which eventually led them to his hideout. Procházka spent the last years of his life writing memoirs. He did not omit a single important case, describing each with scientific precision and emphasis on the methods used. His book became not only a valuable historical document, but also a practical guide for future generations of criminalists. He died in 1925, but his methods live on. Every day, criminalists go to cases equipped with modern materials for securing tracks. Every day, another cast is made, another piece of evidence, another step on the path to justice. And somewhere in the distance, Josef Procházka might be smiling, seeing how his modest experiment with plaster and tracks in the snow has developed into a sophisticated scientific method, without which modern criminalistics can no longer be imagined. The end of his story is the beginning of a new chapter in the history of Czech criminalistics, a chapter in which science and deduction play a key role in the fight against crime. Every track tells its story, and every story has its continuation. In 1930, 5 years after Procházka's death, the Prague criminal police dealt with a case that would have remained unsolved without his pioneering work. On a cold November morning, a safe was found robbed in one of Prague's largest banks. The thieves worked overnight, and their craftsmanship indicated professionals. They left no fingerprints, no tools, no usual traces, only a series of shoe prints in the soft clay behind the bank where workers had previously been repairing the sewer. Inspector Václav Toman, who led the investigation, was one of Procházka's last students. He immediately ordered the securing of the tracks according to the master's method. This time they had more modern materials, special dental plaster that captured even the finest details. "Look at this," he showed his assistant one of the casts. "Do you see that distinctive pattern? This is not a common work boot. This is special footwear, probably of foreign manufacture." The following days were spent visiting cobblers and shoe sellers in Prague. Finally, in a small shop in the Old Town, they found a lead. A month ago, they sold 3 pairs of similar shoes. They were indeed special shoes imported from Germany, with a unique sole designed for silent movement. "I remember those customers," the seller said. There were 3 of them, speaking Czech but with a Moravian accent. They paid in cash, in a hurry. This was the first clue that led the police to Moravia. In Brno, they discovered a connection to a known gang specializing in bank robberies. When they arrested them, they found not only part of the loot from the Prague bank, but also those special shoes. Procházka would be pleased, Toman noted as he wrote the final report. His method works even after so many years. But progress didn't stop. During the 1930s, new materials for casting tracks began to be used. Various resins and silicones that allowed even more precise detail capture. The first photographic catalogs of sole patterns were created, enabling quick identification of shoe types. In 1935, a specialized institute for criminalistic methods research was established, where securing and analyzing tracks had its own department. Procházka's original procedures were further developed and refined. One of the most interesting cases of that time occurred in the winter of 1937. In a small village in Vysočina, a series of mysterious burglaries took place. The thief always operated during snowstorms, assuming his tracks would be quickly covered. However, he didn't know that the local constable had completed a course in securing tracks and had the necessary equipment. Even in the worst weather conditions, he managed to obtain quality casts of the tracks. Gradually, he pieced together the perpetrator's movements, the way he walked, the size of his steps, specific features of his shoes. It turned out that the perpetrator was the local postman, who knew the habits of all the residents perfectly. World War II caused some slowdown in the development of criminalistic methods, but a new era began immediately after its end. The most modern materials and technologies from both the West and the East began to arrive in Czechoslovakia. By the 1950s, every regional administration of the SNB had its technical department equipped for securing tracks. Procházka's method became a fundamental part of the training of all criminalists. It was symbolic when, in 1952, exactly 50 years after the first use of plaster casts, this method helped solve a case very similar to Procházka's. Again, it was a murder in Stromovka, and again, the key evidence was tracks in the snowy park. "It's like we're closing a circle," said the now old Inspector Toman to the young colleagues. But in reality, it's more of a spiral. With each case, we move further, learn new things, refine old methods. The late 1950s brought another revolution. Synthetic materials began to be used, allowing casts to be made even in extreme weather conditions. The first portable laboratories for securing tracks directly at the crime scene were created. In the 1960s, systematic collections of casts and photographs of various types of footwear began to be built. The first computer databases were created, allowing quick comparison of sole patterns. Procházka's legacy lived on in international cooperation. Czech experiences in securing tracks were valued throughout the Eastern Bloc and later in the West. Czech criminalists were invited to international conferences where they presented their methods and results. The 1970s brought another technological revolution. Latex compounds began to be used for securing tracks on vertical surfaces. This opened up entirely new possibilities in investigating burglary cases where perpetrators left tracks on walls or windows. The 1980s saw the first attempts at computer reconstruction of the perpetrator's movements based on tracks. Special programs were created that could calculate the height, weight, and gait of the person from a series of prints. After the revolution in 1989, new opportunities opened up for Czech criminalistics. Modern technologies from the West, previously inaccessible, allowed further refinement of track-securing methods. Specialized laboratories equipped with the latest technology were established. Yet the basic principles that Procházka introduced over 100 years ago remain valid today. Every criminalist knows that careful securing of tracks at the crime scene is the foundation of a successful investigation. In 2002, 100 years after the first use of plaster casts, the Criminalistic Museum in Prague held an exhibition dedicated to the development of track-securing methods. The centerpiece of the exhibition was Procházka's original casts from the case of Marie Novotná, silent witnesses to the beginning of the scientific era of Czech criminalistics. "It's fascinating to see how far we've come," said the director of the Criminalistic Institute at the opening of the exhibition. "But even more fascinating is realizing that the basic principles remain the same." Procházka's words still hold true. Every track tells a story. We just have to learn to read it. Today, in the age of digital technologies and artificial intelligence, the method of casting tracks may seem outdated. But the opposite is true. Modern materials and procedures have made it even more precise and reliable. And in combination with other methods, such as 3D scanning or computer analysis, it remains one of the fundamental tools of criminal. Procházka's legacy lives on in the current training of police officers. Every criminalistics trainee learns how to properly identify, secure, and document tracks at a crime scene. And everyone learns that it's not just about the mechanical application of learned procedures, it's also about the ability to read the tracks, interpret them, and piece together the story of the crime. Thus, more than a century after Inspector Procházka first poured plaster into a track in the snow, his method still helps uncover crimes and bring perpetrators to justice. It is living proof that a well-thought-out method, based on scientific principles, can endure for centuries and remain useful. Perhaps somewhere in the archives, those first plaster casts still lie, a bit chipped, yellowed with time, but still bearing witness to the crime and the man who changed the face of Czech criminalistics. And perhaps whenever criminalists go to a new case with a suitcase full of modern equipment for securing tracks, Josef Procházka is with them in spirit, nodding approvingly that his legacy lives on. Modern criminalistics has long surpassed the boundaries that Procházka could only dream of. In the laboratories of the Criminalistic Institute in Prague, we now find the most modern equipment for track analysis. 3D scanners that can create a perfect digital model of each print, specialized software for comparing sole patterns, and even devices for microscopic analysis of materials transferred onto shoe soles. In 2015, a combination of traditional and modern methods helped solve a complex case of a series of burglaries in Prague museums. The perpetrator was extremely cautious. He used gloves, avoided cameras, and worked at night. But he made one mistake. He left a partial shoe print in the dust at the last crime scene. Criminalists secured the print using electrostatic foil, a method that would surely have fascinated Procházka. Subsequent analysis in the laboratory revealed that it was a limited edition of sports shoes, of which only a few dozen pairs were sold in the Czech Republic. It's like putting together a puzzle, the head of the technical department explained to young colleagues. We have the print, we have the list of sales locations, we have the time frame, and somewhere at the intersection of these pieces of information, we'll find our perpetrator. And he was right. Systematic checking of buyers led to the identification of a suspect, a former restorer who had access to information about museum security. During a house search, they found not only the stolen artifacts, but also the fateful shoes. "I never thought my shoes would give me away," he said during the interrogation. "I thought that in the age of DNA and fingerprints, no one bothered with something as primitive as shoe prints." These words precisely capture why Procházka's method remains relevant. Even in the age of the most modern technologies, basic criminalistic procedures remain indispensable. Perhaps precisely because they are so primitive, perpetrators often underestimate them. In 2018, a new training complex for police officers was opened in Prague, with one of the classrooms named after Procházka. It is equipped with both historical tools for securing tracks and the most modern technology. Students learn that the best results are achieved by combining traditional and modern methods. "Procházka left us more than just a method," says the instructor to young criminalistics trainees. "He left us a way of thinking. He taught that every track is important, that even the smallest detail can be the key to solving a case." Indeed, in recent years, it has become clear that traditional methods of securing tracks are gaining new significance thanks to modern analytical capabilities. For example, gait analysis, which can be read from a series of tracks, has become a separate forensic field. In 2020, gait analysis helped convict the perpetrator of a series of robberies in Brno. The camera footage was of poor quality. The perpetrator's face was not visible, but experts were able to create a profile from his characteristic way of walking, which led to his capture. "It's as if Procházka's legacy is awakening again in the digital age," commented one of the investigators on the case. "His method has not become obsolete. On the contrary, it has gained new dimensions." Current training of criminalists combines traditional procedures with modern technologies. They learn how to properly cast a track in the field, but also how to scan it, digitize it, and analyze it using specialized software. They learn to read tracks not only with their eyes, but also with the help of artificial intelligence. But technology is just a tool, the experienced criminalist reminds his students. The most important thing is still human judgment, the ability to connect the dots, to see the story hidden in the tracks. That's what Procházka taught us. And so, more than a century after its inception, the method of securing tracks lives on. It evolves, adapts to new technologies, but its basic principles remain the same. Every track is a silent witness. Every print tells a story. And the task of the criminalist is to decipher that story. Currently, new materials for securing tracks are being tested in the laboratories of the Criminalistic Institute. More precise methods of analysis are being developed, and more sophisticated databases are being created. But Procházka's basic message remains valid. Criminalistics is a science that must combine precision with intuition, technology with human judgment. The story of Josef Procházka and his pioneering work in the field of securing tracks is more than just a chapter in the history of Czech criminalistics. It is a story of how one person with a good idea can influence the development of an entire field for a century ahead. It is a story that even the simplest method, if based on the right principles, can endure for ages. And so, whenever criminalists go to a new case, whenever they bend over tracks at a crime scene, Josef Procházka is with them in spirit. His legacy lives on in every secured print, in every solved case, in every criminal brought to justice. And it will live on as long as there are tracks and people who know how to read them.